we've talked about laying the groundwork in a hiring process. We've talked about culture and being intentional in your hiring process and growing the team. And now we're going to have a conversation about building a team as managers and what it takes to really manage for performance and growth and for a happy and productive team. So thank you to our panelists for joining us. And if you would, Sue, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about Petal. And in your opinion, what's a good manager? What makes a good manager?
Sure. Hi, I'm Sue, everyone. I'm the Chief People Officer at Petal. We're a startup credit card company that is aimed at providing access to credit to folks who are new to credit, so typically have challenges in order to get credit. So to answer your question, what makes a good manager, or how do I think about a good manager? I think it's someone who is able to enable his or her team to be very productive, as well as professionally fulfilled. So generally, those are the two kind of priorities that I think every manager should be thinking about.
Vivek.
Vivek Sharma. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Movable, Inc. We believe in today's world, visual is a language that moves people. So we work with over 700 brands that have a lot of data about their business, their customers, and we help them translate that in real time into a visual language, whether it's in email marketing, within websites, within display, within mobile apps. We're about a little over 300 people now.
And also one of Inc.'s top places to work.
That's what they say. And we got our start at Brad's former company, General Assembly, where we were in the inaugural class. So a fondness for the place and all the companies that came out of there. What makes a good manager? I don't think I'm the best manager in the world. I pride myself on hiring some really good managers, but I think I've learned how to be a good leader. And the things I focus on are recruiting an amazing team, people who are incredibly talented, and motivating them, and really in being giving them an opportunity to learn and thrive within Movable, Inc. Into 10x what they were when they first arrived at the company. That's kind of a secret goal of mine. I tell every single new hire, I want them to be 10x at some later point, because I was fortunate enough to have an experience like that early in my career.
So you're like taking responsibility for their career in a way when you bring them on.
Yeah, creating an environment where that can happen. They're an equal participant in it. Yeah.
Brad, did you have a choice in being here?
I did. I have all the autonomy in the world. Amanda and I are married. And I'm happy to be on this panel. I'm glad all of you are here. I am the founder and CEO of Common. We design and manage apartment communities really with sharing and density in mind. And prior to this, Common is about 130 full-time. We're 4 years old. We're based here in New York. Prior to this, I was the co-founder of General Assembly, as Vivek nicely mentioned. We were an education company. We started with a co-working component where Movable Inc. got their start, and we grew that to about 500, 600 employees when we sold.
And what is the measure of a good manager?
You know, it's tough, and I would put it. You know, there's a couple of words I would use to describe it. Enablement, I really like that. It is about enabling your employees, about empowering them, and really unlocking what's there, because people do rise to the occasion. There's a panelist on the last panel that mentioned just giving someone who may not have the experience and opportunity. I've generally found I agree that people do rise to the opportunity and rise to the occasion. I would also say flexibility. Good managers are multimodal. They know how to switch between different management mindsets as the need arises. I mean, one I like to describe sometimes the evolution of a lot of managers. A lot of people in their first management role, they start as a micromanager, and then they learn that you shouldn't be a micromanager, and so they don't micromanage anything or anybody, and they step out of the way. And then when someone really becomes a great manager, they learn when to step into the weeds and they learn when to step back, and that actually both of those modes have their place. You just have to apply them in the right way.
Vivek, how would you describe the management model at Movable, Inc.? How do you subscribe to a framework?
Yeah, so things looked very different in getting people aligned and pointed in the right direction in the early days. In fact, at General Assembly, there was never conference room space for us. So
Sorry.
Yeah, but you had a big coat room.
We did.
So
It's a
we
great
used
coat.
that to do stand-up meetings every day and pass around a football. I think there was a photo of that in an early article. So it's very easy to get aligned in an earlier company. And if you get some people who are willing to go through the tough times, it's the external forces that impact you the most and have to do with how someone's feeling emotionally. Much later on, an example of that is like town hall questions that we seem to get right now are very different. It's about getting the right kind of kombucha in the kitchen, or D&I initiatives, employee resource groups, and the nature of it completely changes, and more about the relationship they have with the people and with the space that they're working in. So the structure in terms of performance management, I am a devotee of OKRs. We had a false start with this a couple of years back. OKRs stand for Objectives and Key Results, and it's a system that John Doerr came up with. Actually, John Doerr was a VC at Kleiner Perkins. It was invented at Intel, popularized at Google. And the general idea, you've probably heard about this, but it's to set some aspirational statements about what you're trying to accomplish and set some key results, quantifiable results about what you want to achieve. And it's not an easy thing to pull off. Lots of companies that set out to do OKRs fail the first time around. The tools that you use to manage it can be clunky. So we think we found a pretty good cadence right now. We use Lattice for OKR management, and we have our director of ops kind of being the OKR cop who gets everyone together into a room and focuses and makes sure that we're talking about the right things at a high level. And that's kind of the broad framework and how we align 300 people in moving in the same direction.
What was the false start, and how can other companies who use OKRs avoid that?
Yeah, the first step was just to understand what OKRs even are, and so I did a presentation. I kind of pulled some materials together and used the example of the JFK speech of landing on the moon. Oh, by the way, this shirt is partly tied to our performance. Every year we started doing a theme. So this year we have a space theme, with it being the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. And so all systems go. We did a big company kickoff, flew everyone in, 300 people from around the world. And so everything, I even had an astronaut suit on the kickoff day. So got everyone just wrapped up around this idea, and everyone's like pumped, and they have space themes.
We do promise specific advice and actionable tactics at Stacklist.
Yeah, so I mean, you have to give people, visual is our language, and we want them to remember. And sometimes it's easy to get locked into details. And so having a memorable experience thinking about the stuff. But then you were asking about the false start. It was communicating what OKRs are. It was this moon landing, and then you might build a Land Rover by 1963 that can carry an 8,000-pound payload. So it gets very specific and explaining how stretch goals work. So the idea of OKRs are about if you can achieve 60 to 70% of that goal, you're doing really well. And by stretching yourself to think bigger, you are more likely, even if you miss the trip to Mars, maybe you land on the moon, and there's still something that will level up the company in a pretty significant way. So that is, that's what we've done with OKRs. You need a really simple tool. You can't have a heavy process, and we also don't penalize people for falling short of it. I know different companies do different things with OKRs. We don't bonus people on them. It is mainly an alignment tool and helping everyone think bigger.
So how does this work at Petal?
So probably one thing I should have added is that we're about 90 people, so we're much smaller than both of your companies, I think. And so a lot of this stuff we're kind of going through sort of as we speak. So when I think about performance management, I'm not just thinking about the kind of what gets accomplished, which is what OKRs are really good at aligning and making sure everyone knows what the big goals are for the company. I'm thinking about that plus the kind of behaviors that we want to support and making sure people are very clear on what the expectations are. And so when we were only 15 people, we actually had our first round of performance reviews based on just kind of what the co-founders thought were important. It was before my time. But now, kind of year and a half later, we now have a semi-annual process that takes into account very clear expectations across all levels of the organization. And I think one thing I've heard kind of throughout the day is this notion of levels, but I don't think we've really kind of dived into what we're talking about. When you have 15 people, probably no need for levels, but as you get bigger, it's helpful to be able to define what does a VP look like? What does a director look like? What does a manager look like? And be very, very clear on what those kind of expectations are. And so the way we do it, and we did it very early at 50 people, is we rolled out kind of essentially it's like a competency matrix, but it's a little bit more than that, that expresses, here's what we expect. This is what great performance at Petal looks like across self-leadership, thought leadership, people leadership, and results orientation. So results orientation is related to OKRs, but it's not just about hitting them. It's like the behaviors behind actually hitting them. And then the other thing I just want to mention about the way we think about performance management, like I mentioned self-leadership, which is something that I haven't seen in other competency matrices or any kind of performance expectation profiles. And it's really about EQ, it's about being able to work in ambiguity, it's about curiosity. It's actually all the things that ultimately is what differentiates someone who's good at their job and someone who's really excellent. And so we make that really explicit because we think it's important for people to know how they're going to be evaluated.
So before 15 people, did any of these things apply to how you operated?
It was before my time. So I'd say no, because it was just 15 people. But the first time we had all of this stuff in place was when we were about 50.
Do you have, kind of as an expert in the field, do you have opinions about how people who are smaller than 15 people, maybe just 5 people, can adopt some of these principles?
I think it starts, and again, we talked about this a lot, is the values and making that really clear. So you can start there with like, what do you want to represent? What does your company look like? What kind of people do you want to attract to your company? And then blow that out into like very specific behaviors and traits that would support that. I think that's probably a good start for like a company that's fairly small. And then, when you feel like there's, you start hearing from people being like, oh, I don't know what my career path is, or, what does it mean to grow here? That's probably a clue that you need to do something.
Brad, you subscribe to OKRs. You did it at GA and now at Common. What's the difference between managing for OKRs and doing performance management reviews? Are those two connected, or are they separate?
Yeah, they can be related, but they need to be separate. I totally agree with Vivek. We don't punish people for missing KRs. We say, hey, if quarter over quarter over quarter, you're all red, like that's a problem. That might be a goal setting problem. Like maybe you're pivoting your focus too much. Maybe you're being too aggressive. But like they should be stretch goals, and it's okay to not hit them. That's the point. So you can use OKRs to inform performance management, but you should not make that tie incredibly explicit where to the point that people are trying to game their OKRs or sandbagging their OKRs or things like that. So, the performance management, it gets more formal as a company grows. And I think to your point, there are certain things that only make sense to roll out at a larger company. Levels, for instance, can be actively harmful at an early stage if you try to put too much just structure onto what is almost by definition an amorphous 10-person team where a lot of people are wearing multiple hats and it's not really sure, how it will shake out as the company grows. I do think OKRs are totally fine to do and actually should be done from day one. Mm-hmm. You can do OKRs as an individual. Like, hey, the objective is I would like to get more fit. The KR is I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a week. I'm going to run a 7-minute mile. Like, you could do personal KRs and that can be very useful.
He does do this.
Wasn't going to say that. Does he pull you into
those KRs?
Oh, we have quarterly check-ins.
Next question.
I want to hear.
So I have a tie into both of those things. And so
thanks.
Pay me the $20 later. In both of these cases, I wish I was smart enough to recognize the signs early enough, but we got to like 60 people and we never had career ladders, or the early people were just motivated to make the company a success. And so I hadn't thought long enough about, people are in here for their own careers and their own development. We'd be more methodical about it. Same way with OKRs, we hadn't used them for a long time. And then you start to see some smoke. little things start to happen where the BD team gets all these partnerships done and the product team isn't even going to build any integrations against this, and the sales team cares about something different. So everyone's working hard. They're hardworking. They are killing themselves, but they're moving in different directions. And so you are not creating an edge for the company to actually be able to make something important happen. And it's so painful when you recognize that and you realize we have to fix this right away, or people are going to burn out, they're going to quit, and nothing will move forward in the business.
Vivek, do you wish that you had, looking back then, do you wish you had implemented OKRs in a different way or in some better way at the very beginning? Or how would you do that differently another time around?
Yeah, I think informally I was coming up with my own OKRs. I wasn't expecting that of the rest of the team. And I was sort of the product manager, and I'm codifying a lot more things around process today. There's one example of a thing that we knew how to do early in the company's life, which was build a product and find a way to product market fit. Trial and error. Founders are good at this, or they find a way there. Later on in a company, you have to describe exactly how that works, because I've handed this over to some other people. I remember hearing Phil Fernandez of Marketo speak. They were at 300 million in ARR. They were not good at, they could write new code, build new products, but they weren't successful at launching it. So everything becomes like a class. I think about, how do I turn this into a training? I'm creating this concept called an expedition, breaking down the steps that are needed, and what's the minimal set of things you actually have to do to get to a product market fit and not waste your time with big company kind of check the box, what's the legal terms, et cetera. The later stage employees don't know this. They've never experienced it before. And you can run into, so training and learning and development, that's another big investment for us. We don't blame people because they don't know certain types of things, but we have a training department, we have a curriculum, we have courseware that we've invested in because people just won't get there on their own.
Mm-hmm. And Sue, if you both of these guys are, speaking as founders, and how, maybe you've had more contact with the people who are, working at the company and working on, within frameworks like OKRs that have been chosen for them. Do employees have a good relationship with OKRs or another like framework, or is it?
Yeah,
nuance?
I think it's not necessarily accurate to say that the OKRs have been chosen for them. So in our case, we started off with just like a plain old, without the jargon, just call them goals, because that's essentially what OKRs are. So we just called them goals, strategies, initiatives. That was in Q2. That was 4 months after we launched our card. So it's the first time we actually had real data to be able to set real targets, because before then it was a bit of a swag. And that came more top down. So that was from our leadership team. We got together, we said, these are the top priorities, and then let's bubble it down. This time for Q3, because we're constantly iterating, is we changed the name to OKRs, and we asked all the functions to get together with their teams and think about what they want to be able to achieve, so they feel the ownership and the tie-in between what they're doing and what the function and what the company's doing. And so I think for Q4, we may actually take it a step even further and think about kind of reorganizing the team a bit more against squads. So squads, in case that's a new concept, is the idea of having teams that are dedicated to specific tracks of the product. So you would have like a dedicated PM, a tech lead, some engineers, a designer, and they're just focused on that particular part of the product. So we're thinking about moving into that direction, as well as allowing them to define to us what the OKR should be.
Hey, so it's a 360 activity. And on that note, can we talk about reviews for a minute? How do reviews operate? Brad, we'll start with you. In the first 5 employees, let's say, of Common, how did you run a reviews process, or did you?
I don't think we did for the first 5 employees. I think we probably introduced formal reviews around 20, 25, 30. Because you don't want the formal review process to displace the informal feedback. And so, I came from a place, General Assembly, where we had very formal reviews and formal feedback. But, we wanted to build a culture from day one. And I think we had a little bit of a reticent culture in the early days of sharing feedback. And we wanted to build a culture of when you have feedback, find a nonviolent way to communicate that feedback in a way that's constructive, but share that.
It's a low bar.
Nonviolent and like, you know what I mean, and then, you know, from a verbal standpoint, and also from a physical standpoint. But we fortunately have not had that problem. We started introducing regular reviews at around 25 people, performance reviews, and we made a decision, which I stand by, although it does get some pushback within the org, that we do them quarterly, which seems really heavy and really frequent. But they're also very light. It's like 2 questions. What did this person do to contribute, you know, to the company's success? And what could this person have done better? And then there's also an option to provide private feedback. It's all public. There's different factions that argue about, like, should it be public, not public to the whole company, but public to the person reviewing? Should it be anonymous to the person's manager? We've erred on the side of public, that everyone should see who reviewed them and what they said about them. We've removed scores. There's no more scores on the upward and peer reviews. The manager does provide a score to the employee. Happy to go more into that. And it's generally, I think we've stabilized at a pretty good place where it's, you know, light quarterly reviews, upward reviews, peer reviews, manager reviews, score with the manager review.
Sue, do you think that reviews have a place in the first 5 or 10 people?
Probably not, because I think it's so early. But I do want to differentiate reviews from feedback. So feedback is more in the moment, right after something, and usually fairly tactical. Reviews are more holistic and thinking about that person's performance relative to what we want for that role. And it also usually has a component that's developmental, talking about what you should be thinking about for the next 6 months. So so for us, like, again, we did it at 15, then we did it at around 50, and we're continuing to use kind of the same process that we have, which is, I'd say, fairly lightweight as well. We do it every 6 months. We use Google Forms, which I remember someone else talked about Google Forms, my best friend, Google Forms. It's cheap and it's effective. And we do the peer, we do upward, we do self, and then the manager synthesizes all of that and comes up with a overall kind of performance review. And I think it's worked pretty well.
Vivek, how do you handle employees that are not performing where they need to be?
Yeah. So, you know,
in a nonviolent way.
Okay, pass. No. The most obvious way, you know, when someone's not performing is when you're up at night and it's like midnight and you can't sleep because there's something on your mind and it, like, those thoughts just won't, like, get out of your mind. Like, that's the clearest sign that there's an unresolved issue that you haven't cleared, and something sort of bubbling up. And so I've started to get more attuned to that. And immediately there's an issue clearing framework I've learned. I was a member of YPO, Young Presidents, or it's a CEO peer group. And so, you know, immediately when you feel like there's something wrong, whether it is performance related, whether it is style related, whether it's something that you know, just sort of, you might not even be aware exactly what it is, but you sense there's something off with your relationship with someone. So if there's something that you're aware of, you know, state the facts of the matter, talk about how it makes you feel, share the story, the narrative in your head about what this means, talk about the change that you'd like to see. So all of these things that you're sharing are not, and this is a very surprising thing. The first time I learned it is like, no, someone's going to get it. It's very hard to give someone feedback. That they're going to kind of clam up. But the facts are kind of indisputable. Your own emotions are something that you can't control. Your own story may be real, may not. But very often I find that person is unaware that you are feeling these things and these things were going on. And they don't even have to respond to it right then. They can collect themselves and kind of process it. And it often leads to a chorus of, wow, I had no idea that this was a thing. I will start to do these things so you don't feel that way in the future. So the number one thing, I think people have a hard time with direct conversations, even a 300-person company, and you know, we want to help train people on how to do that effectively. So if it's keeping you up at night, issue clear something.
And what you're describing, I think, is something that can as easily happen with 3 employees as it can with 300. And so what do you do? Because I'll speak for myself. I feel like there are moments when I feel frustration, but I think that some of it could be because I'm not setting goals well or something like that. But that's kind of the nature of the beast when it comes to a startup. So how do you reconcile not necessarily having a crisp vision all the time with expecting kind of your team to be performing at their best? Do you know what I mean? There's a kind of dynamic nature, and how do you work within that from a performance perspective?
Maybe to build on what Vivek was saying, you gave a great story about, when someone responds well to feedback. Feedback is important at every stage, and the conversation doesn't always go that well. And I think a lot of it for me comes down to, how well is a person who's not performing or is doing something that's bothering me, how well are they receiving that feedback? Are they accepting the feedback? Are they, some people are eager for feedback and will do what they can and hustle to implement that feedback. And one thing I like to say is it's actually extraordinarily difficult to get fired if you're great at receiving feedback and you really try to incorporate that feedback. It's extraordinarily hard to get fired. But the flip side is also true. If you're bad at receiving feedback, if you're defensive and you don't want to hear it, it's easy for that to go down the wrong path, even for trivial issues. And that's something that is so important. It's even more important in an early stage company because you're setting the precedents that future employees will come to see. I mean, you're really defined by not what you say, not what you encourage, but by what you allow.
The one thing I'd ask about, mention about the precedent is it's important that you are leading by example. So, for many years we were doing 360 reviews for the employees, but I wasn't getting the feedback that I, am giving to people. So I realized this, and I also wanted to make it a safe space for people to do that. So my co-founder would go solicit the 360 feedback, anonymize it, and collate it, and share it with me. And yeah, then you are living the same thing. And it's like sometimes it's tough to take. It's like, wow, Vivek wanted, it's uncertain which initiatives we really want to follow through and which ones are experiments or just ideas. So people are feeling like, jumping between this and the other thing. So it's hard to take some of these things, but you're like, wow, this is incredibly valuable. It's happening. People are feeling this way. And now I'm aware of it and I can change some sort of behavior in order to help people be more successful. So I think you have to, whatever you're doing, I think you have to be willing to receive it yourself. And I started soliciting from our board. I get a net promoter score after every board meeting, and I say, "How's everyone feeling?" Scale of 1 to 10, privately with them, and what worries you, what concerns you right now, and I share that with the team, with our executive team too. So I share our NPS as a company, and this just it forces us to have good conversations and doesn't have anyone harbor bad feelings or things we're not talking about.
So curious, what's the NPS question? How likely are you to recommend Vivek to a fellow investor?
It's just a feeling of on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel about Movable Inc?
Okay.
Yeah.
So it sounded. Did you?
No, I'm thinking about the responses, and of course, feedback is important, and it's certainly something that we train everyone on. And so I kind of go back to, and I don't mean to, I think a little bit of a difference between both of you and I is I do come from more of a let's put some structure in and let's be really explicit about what our expectations are, because I feel like it's only fair for people to know how they're being evaluated or assessed. And so it's really, really critical that you get those things right, framing those expectations. So within our, self-leadership category, we talk about feedback, openness to that, and curiosity as part of our values. But I think when we're talking about underperformers, you can think of them in different categories. So there's some underperformers that are simply just unable to do the work or unskilled, and those are pretty straightforward. Those are just hey, this is what you need to do. Oh, you're not doing it. Okay, let's have a conversation. I think the much more difficult ones are the ones where it's something about their perception of something. It's a human dynamic thing. And I'm trying to imagine a conversation that you're describing where you would come in and talk to me and be something makes me uncomfortable, but you can't really put your finger on it. I'd be I don't really know what it is. And it'd be really quite scary for me. And so I think that you really do need to think before you give feedback about what is the behavior you want to see changed, and really be able to articulate that in an actionable way, or else it's just going to cause disruption. So that's probably my feedback on that. And then, I think there's another category. I'm so sorry. About under.
No, just to add the bookends on it. Two things I forgot to mention. You have to first ask. I have some feedback for you. Is this a good time to talk? Because someone could be in a very different state of mind. It's not a good time. And finally, there should be a clear ask that, hey, this is what I'd like to see changed. So really good points. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm totally blabbing and monopolizing this conversation. But the other thing I was going to say about underperformance, and this is something that I'd love to hear your perspectives on as co-founders, is the most difficult type of underperformance, in my opinion, is when someone was great at one point and was perfect for the job when you were a 10-person, 20-person company, but then you've now scaled and the team that you have today is not the team you need. And so having that conversation, I know someone, the gentleman earlier who was talking about how titles are free, I'm totally opposed to that concept, to be completely honest, because if you're going to be a successful company and you're going to scale, you're going to have to deal with the impact of giving away titles. I think that's a question for you. How do you broach that topic? Do you do things like Netflix where you have that conversation up front and say, look, when we're kind of tired of you and you're no longer performing to the expectations, we're going to move on. I feel like that's pretty challenging because you then end up with someone who's kind of half in, half out, and you really want people to have that loyalty, especially in the early days.
Yeah, I don't see how that conversation would work. I mean, because it's once someone's in, they're in. And even if you preface it, you could preface it all day long and you could talk about how, some people are fits for certain stages of the business. That's 100% true. And you can intellectually understand that. But that's a very different thing than hey, you are not a fit for this stage of the business. That's a hard conversation, however much you preface it. It's just one of those things. And you have to go through the process. And in some cases, we've had great examples of someone finding another role. We also did this thing, which I will absolutely swear by. It's kind of weird, but the titles we had at an early stage were different than the titles we had at a growth stage. And they pretty much did not overlap at all. And it caused a lot of confusion as we were transitioning, but it also let us, in some ways, have a smoother transition because we were hey, we're sunsetting this title. An entire level of the organization basically went away. And that let us, and there were some people who had that title that we actually transitioned into, it was head of. Which is a very beautifully ambiguous title. And actually, I don't object to it because some of those head of people became, VPs or directors. Some of them left the company. And in all situations, it was the right outcome for those people and for the company. And I think the flip side is you have to build a reputation as an employer that when someone leaves, obviously caveats to for people who did, genuinely bad things that got them shown the door. You have to be good to those people. You have to have generous severance packages. In some cases, we accelerate equity vesting. We've extended the exercise window on options in some instances. You help them find their next job. You provide a good reference. So I actually am still close and chat on a pretty regular basis with some people that we fired. And I think that's a good standard to uphold and you can build a reputation by doing that of hey, Common's not gonna, do the dirty when they're done with you. That's, I think, a good thing to have.
Well, Sue or Vivek, what advice do you have on hiring over someone as an organization grows? Surely that happens.
Yeah. Setting the expectation, I feel like everyone has a shot at earning that next role within the company, and you generally prefer to invest in the person that you have. And we're big believers in growth mindset and giving people a chance to become that next person. I've had to do that. I was not qualified to be the CEO of a 20-person company or but it's amazing when you find people who are willing to be coachable, to take feedback, to rise to the level of expectation above them. Sometimes you feel that doesn't happen, and some people are okay with that. My first salesperson did an amazing job, got us to probably sold the first 15 or 20 deals, but he realized he was not the person who was going to be managing all of the sales team. And we kind of had that kind of conversation early on, and we hired a CRO, and we had 2 candidates, and one of them seemed perfectly capable, perfectly nice, but he said, look, I like this guy, he's good, he's nice, he'll be my friend. The other guy, Tim, I'm a little afraid of, he's gonna challenge me, I think you should hire Tim. And we did, and Tim got us up to like 20 million in ARR over the course of the years. So I think just having those open conversations. Michael, my co-founder, it was clear he wasn't going to want to manage people, so we hired a director of engineering as like hire number 3. Yeah. He's now our SVP of engineering, and he's grown with the company over the last eight years. So address it early.
Yeah, it sounds like, to employ a simple cliche, but that there needs to be a cross-team mentality that a rising tide raises all boats, and that applies to every employee, whether they're being hired over or under. So,
There's one piece. It's a Silicon Valley analogy, and I don't know. It's kind of a militaristic angle on it. But the early people are like Navy SEALs. They're not. They might smell funny. They might be a little rude. They might be a little rough around the edges. But they need to make the impossible happen. Later on, when their job is done, the army kind of comes over and keeps the peace, and eventually the police force keeps order. And companies go through these transitions. It's a natural thing to have happen. And not everyone makes the switch between those transitions. They're not built for that, and they don't seek that, and to kind of have those honest conversations.
So, yeah.
I was just going to add, so I think having the framework very early on about what those levels look like and defining them in a way that you can then coach to people into it. So let's say we have some directors who want to become a VP. I'm like, this is what a VP looks like. This is what we expect from them. They need to be looking out 2 years in advance and like thinking through all the strategies and things like that. And so they now know what they need to work on. And so they feel like they have like a real chance. They may not be able to get there, but they at least have that ability. And then if we at some point say, look, we are at a point as in the business where we do need to hire someone with experience who would come in as a VP, it's kind of clear about what this person, the differential between what the value add of what they're going to bring. Mm-hmm. So I think just having something like that really early makes the conversation so much smoother later down the line.
One last question. Early days, what's the most important quality in the first 5 hires? Is it about their skill? Is it about a different set of qualities?
Ability to suffer through change. Like, there's going to be a lot of change in the early days. I mean, things will happen, surprises will come up, roles will shift, and the more adaptable someone is, the better they're going to ride through those waves in the early days. Note that capability can be actively harmful as a company gets more established, because in many cases, those people love those kind of changes and enjoy that and live by that chaos.
Which applies to founders too.
100%.
Yeah.
And we should all keep in mind, or at least 2 of us as founders, or we in this room as founders, at one point it might be you telling your your VP or your head of that they're no longer a fit for the role, but year or 2 down the road, it might be your independent board director calling you up and telling you the same thing. Just remember it. I mean, it happens. It's the nature of the game.
Yeah. 3 core values emerged for our company: curiosity, empathy, and grit. I think Brad speaks to the grit that's required in the early days. So if I'm picking one other thing, it would be curiosity. You kind of have to be a learning machine. I didn't know what an ESP was. It stands for email service provider, and I'm running an email company of 300 people. So I had to log into MailChimp and get an account and send our emails out. And so just be willing to be completely clueless when you walk into a room, not know stuff. But if you have a capacity to learn, that's the big thing I look for in all the early people.
Great. Yeah, and I think if I could add a third, it's drive. I think it's someone who's like self-driven and has the curiosity to kind of dig in, has the grit that's going to stick around. I think that's key.
Thanks, everybody. Any questions from the audience? Can everybody raise your hands so we can see? Great.
Hi. So I started my own company and we have about 17 people now. And I feel like I've been hearing a lot of conflicting ideologies about when the right time to have this sort of structure when it comes to levels and career progression and reviews. And I think we started it pretty early at 12-ish people. And now I'm hearing in a lot of these conversations, we probably wouldn't have done it so early. And I get a lot of feedback from my employees that they want that. So that's why we're trying to give it. But personally, I feel like just focus on the growth of the company. So at that stage of growth, and we have investors, we just raised a Series A in the fall. Do you guys have any advice on like
how to kind of to fade in the levels? Is that, advice on transitioning to that kind of schedule, or to not do it at all?
How much importance I should put on it?
Vivek, you want to?
Yeah, so you will get a lot of conflicting advice throughout your role as a CEO, as a founder. It's your job to figure out what's appropriate, what's situationally right for you, what's in the right context. I'm biased to keeping things simple, so everything can probably be boiled down. Our sales trainer has this habit of 3 up, 3 down after every sales call. 3 things you did really well, 3 things that could be an area of improvement. And it can be as simple as focusing on just establishing a cadence of feedback and being regular rather than this big architected thing that nobody actually carries through.
It's almost like lean methodology applied to management and team structure.
To everything.
Yeah, I was just one little, I think, piece of advice. Like, there's no right answer to any of this shit. It's just like, there's a lot of things that in many instances have been shown to work or be necessary or be beneficial. And there's like certainly a lot of kind of horror stories out there of things going really awry. It sounds like just the fact that you're thinking about it and having this conversation and having this question is like shows that you're already ahead of the curve. Because frankly, a lot of founders of 17-person companies aren't even thinking about it. That's not even on their radar. So the fact that you're even thinking about it and having the internal debate of like, is it too early? I want people to focus on growth, but like we also need, people are craving some of this. Like you're in a good place.
Next question. Who has the mic?
Just thinking about all this conversation that you've had about transparency, and I'm just curious what your experience has been about the limitations of transparency, and when does it become too much or too little, if you've experienced that.
Sue, do you have a response to that?
Can you be more specific about when we spoke about transparency?
So transparency is about how open you are with people and the organization, either about the business, about performance, about behaviors, about what you're doing where it gets difficult. We were talking, for example, the difficulty of telling somebody who has outgrown and are not adapting.
Yeah. So I think, so at Petal, at least we strive to be super transparent about the business, about performance. I think where the challenges can lie is when you have to think about maintaining employee morale. So, if something is going really south on the business side, how much do you really want to disclose? And I think you just need to be really measured about how you approach that. But otherwise, like we're pretty transparent about things.
Yeah, we have a work value default to transparency, and it's very intentionally written. It's like transparency should be the default setting, but of course, there's some times where you need to go another route. And I think employee morale is a great way to think about that. Like if sharing something would not be super productive in terms of fixing it, and 2, would risk seriously jeopardizing employee morale, may not be a good area to be transparent.
There's some nuance around this too. Later on, we share the financials with every employee at every town hall, but we provide a talk track too, because they're not sitting in every single meeting and may not know what each of these things means. So here's my interpretation, but here's the data, and you can draw your own conclusions if you'd like. Separate from that, there's the privacy of an individual that we, in the early days when you're 30 or 40 people, if I fired someone, everyone kind of knew, and there was like room, you'd kind of see it all happen. And in that case, you kind of have to bias to being upfront. with, hey, I fired this person, they weren't cutting it at this level, or they were toxic in such and such way. Later on, when we're 230 people, that's just cruel to the person and it's unnecessary. The company can deal with people leaving and moving on, and you see more of those emails. Joe left to spend more time with his family and kids. So that's to be protective of this person's privacy and not to harm their future, and focus on the things that need to happen in the business.
Thank you. Next question. Thanks for that question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm from a company called Stacklist. We've talked about 360 reviews and we've talked about performance reviews, but we haven't talked a lot about one-on-ones yet. So I'm curious if you use them and how they complement those other things that you're using.
One-on-ones. Anybody?
Yeah, I mean, we have weekly, every person has a weekly one-on-one with their manager. The trick, in my view, to making a good one-on-one is that it can't be about status updates. So we use a tool called 15.5, where every employee fills it out prior to the one-on-one, and the idea is that the manager has read it prior to the meeting, and all it pretty much is 5 questions. What are you doing this week? What did you accomplish last week? Where do you need strategic thought partnership? What are your resource bottlenecks, or where are you bottlenecked? And what's keeping you up at night? And the idea is it takes 15 minutes to fill out, 5 minutes to read, and then the one-on-one can actually focus on those big strategic questions like, okay, cool, I have a list as a manager, I have a list of the 3 things in front of me that actually we need to talk about. And I know what is keeping the employee up at night. So bad one-on-ones, or you sit down like, hey, how's it going? What are you working on? Like, that's bad. Don't do that.
Yeah, I agreed with the rough framework, and I also always start with, what are you excited about right now? I just want to start in a positive, like, what's this person? But I have the what's keeping you up at night too. It's the question that you have to ask. But importantly, with the one-on-ones, it's not just your own one-on-ones. As you have a larger company, you want to make sure that the managers you have in positions that, look, you might be a good guy, good gal, but how you behave isn't necessarily the experience every employee will have. Everyone has a manager in a company, and that is their experience of working at that company. And so if you don't have high standards for how managers should act, how one-on-ones should go, that might not be happening at all, and 80% of your company might be completely dissatisfied, and you're unaware of it. So it's also a reporting tool for me that one-on-ones are happening. And so we use Lattice, a similar type of thing, but you have some instrumentation that shows you, hey, this is a regular part of how we operate, and you can ask follow-on questions with people to ensure that's being operated on.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'd echo everything they're saying. I don't think you need to have a tool, though. You could use Google Forms. So for what it's worth, like it's a tool, but it's kind of a free one. So we do a employee engagement survey, and we ask, like, how are managers doing? And like, while I'm not able to ensure that every manager is having one-on-ones, like, I know that 80% of our employees said that they get actionable feedback from their managers regularly. So that's useful for me.
I think Google tools are perfect, and I think you should use them as long as you can. Do you really want to adopt some other company's framework of thinking before you know your own? In certain cases, it doesn't apply. But anyway, I appreciate that and appreciate the question. Thank you so much to our panelists.